The gate was closed, not for maintenance, not for winter. It was closed because someone decided that a place built to be seen needed to disappear for a while. The animals were still there. The buildings were still standing, but the flow had been cut off. Silence began to occupy spaces that had once been filled with footsteps, voices, cars pulling in, families arriving without thinking about what existed behind the scenery. Some employees arrived that morning and received no complete explanation, only practical instruction, blocked paths, isolated areas, no interviews, no comment. The kind of decision that only happens when something has already gone wrong, before anyone realizes there was a risk. It wasn't a sudden shutdown. It was a gradual emptying. First one event canceled, then another. Then areas labeled temporarily restricted, until the entire place began to resemble a set built for an audience that would never arrive. What stood out wasn't abandonment. It was contrast, a space created for exposure, now shielded from view. A heritage meant to function as a symbol, transformed into a logistical problem. Some said it wasn't permanent. Others swore the pause concealed something larger. The concrete fact was simple. One of the most recognizable addresses linked to one of the most powerful families in American industry had become inconvenient, and no one seemed willing to explain why. In the days that followed, the closure began producing side effects. Guides without routes, temporary workers dismissed with no return date, small local suppliers losing contracts that had existed for decades. The cost didn't appear in official numbers, but in empty calendars and unanswered phone calls. The place still existed, but it no longer fulfilled its primary function, showing something. That was unusual. Spaces like this tend to survive economic crises, political shifts, even personal tragedies. They are maintained precisely because they carry a convenient narrative. But here, something had interrupted continuity. One version circulating among longtime employees claimed the problem wasn't financial. Another, repeated in low voices, suggested the decision came too quickly to be purely strategic. There were also those who believed the closure was merely the visible symptom of wear that had been accumulating for years. None of this was confirmed. What was known was only the effect: closed doors where free passage had always existed. Those who knew the place understood it had never been just a tourist attraction. It was a carefully constructed showcase. Every path, every building, every route offered to visitors was part of a script designed to tell a specific story. That's why the silence felt wrong. A security guard remarked, away from any microphones, that the order felt more defensive than administrative. It wasn't, "We're renovating." It was, "We're containing." Containing curiosity, containing circulation, containing questions that were beginning to emerge outside institutional control. The problem surfaced when it was already too late to pretend things were normal. Meanwhile, outside the gates, public perception began to shift. A place once associated with tradition and continuity started being cited as an example of instability. Reports avoided detail. Official statements used language far too generic for something so symbolic. Some regular visitors noticed immediately, others didn't at first. But absence began to generate noise. Why would a place like this need to hide? This is where versions begin to multiply. Some believed internal decisions, made long ago, had pushed the space into an unsustainable situation. Others insisted the problem wasn't the location itself, but what it represented. An inheritance too heavy for the present moment. There was also an explanation that never appeared in official communications, but circulated persistently. The idea that the place had become too large to remain merely symbolic, and too small to support the weight it carried. None of this was said officially. None of it was confirmed. But the closure remained. What makes everything stranger is that the place had always been presented as stable, almost immune to time, a fixed point amid change, a space associated with permanence, not rupture. So when the doors closed, it didn't feel like an isolated decision. It felt like the visible consequence of something that had been pushed forward for convenience. A story that refused to disappear began circulating, that the mistake wasn't in the present, but in choices made too long ago to be revised now. Perhaps that's why silence became the temporary solution. In public records, the place still exists. Grant's Farm. On maps, nothing changed. In practice, almost everything did. And that kind of discrepancy never happens by accident. Before becoming an operational problem, it seemed to be a problem of meaning, something that worked as long as everyone accepted the original narrative, something that began to fail when the context changed, but the structure stayed the same. The strange detail is that no one tried to retell the story. They chose to interrupt it. From this point on, the records grow less clear. This is where unconfirmed accounts begin, conflicting interpretations, versions that were never officially closed. Before moving forward, it's important to state, this narrative combines historical facts with unconfirmed rumors, presented solely as entertainment. What follows is not only about a closed space, it is about a symbol that began demanding a price too high to continue functioning in the same way. And that cost did not begin now. The first thing people noticed was not what had changed, but what refused to change. The paths were the same. The buildings stood where they always had. The fences still marked boundaries that no visitor ever questioned. Yet something about the place had begun to feel misaligned, as if it were performing a role written for a different era. Those who worked there longest were the first to sense it, not because they had inside information, but because repetition sharpens perception. When you guide the same routes year after year, you notice when the story stops landing the way it once did. It wasn't a single decision that caused discomfort. It was accumulation. A story repeated too often without adjustment eventually starts to expose its seam. The gestures remain, but the conviction behind them weakens. Smiles turn mechanical. Explanations become shorter. Certain questions start getting deflected instead of answered. What visitors saw was charm. What staff felt was strain. For decades, the place had been presented as continuity made physical, not a museum frozen in time, but a living inheritance. Animals grazing calmly, structures maintained just enough to look timeless. A narrative that suggested permanence without ever saying the word. But permanence is expensive. Maintenance wasn't just about buildings or grounds. It was about keeping a version of the past acceptable in the present. And that task grew more complex as expectations shifted. A version circulated among former administrators that the problem began when the place was asked to perform two incompatible roles at once: legacy monument and contemporary attraction. One required reverence, the other required adaptation. Trying to satisfy both created friction no brochure could smooth over. Nothing broke overnight. Things simply stopped aligning. There were moments when the tension surfaced publicly, though never fully explained. Small controversy, quiet policy changes, adjustments framed as improvements that, to those paying attention, felt defensive. Some exhibits were modified without explanation. Certain traditions were quietly retired. Language used in official materials softened, then generalized, then repeated until it lost specificity altogether. What many assumed was modernization may have been containment. The problem appeared when even those adjustments stopped working. An account repeated by several former employees described meetings that grew shorter but heavier. Fewer decisions were made, yet more rules were introduced. The atmosphere shifted from presentation to risk management. The place had become less about telling a story and more about preventing the wrong one from emerging. No one said this out loud, of course, but behavior communicates what words avoid. What complicated matters was scale. The estate was never designed to be small, but it was never meant to be abstract either. It was personal in origin, symbolic in function, and public in exposure. That combination only works when the narrative remains emotionally legible. Once it stops making sense, scale becomes liability. One former guide recalled being asked a question she had answered 100 times before. This time, the answer felt insufficient, even to her own ears. She finished the explanation and realized she was no longer sure what it was supposed to justify. She didn't report this. There was no category for that kind of issue. Outside, perception shifted more slowly. Most visitors still saw what they expected to see, but a smaller group, journalists, historians, critics, began noticing the gaps. Why was certain information absent? Why were some aspects emphasized while others quietly disappeared? Why did official messaging feel increasingly careful? No single article captured it. No exposé landed. Instead, a low-level discomfort formed, the kind that doesn't provoke outrage but erodes trust. And trust, once thinned, does not recover easily. At some point, a line was crossed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but decisively. The estate stopped being an asset that explained itself. From that moment on, it required constant justification. Some believe that was when the decision to close, at least temporarily, became inevitable. Others argue the closure was less a decision and more an admission. The structure could no longer carry what was being placed upon it. Again, nothing confirmed, only outcomes observed. What makes this period difficult to reconstruct is how little was recorded officially. Press releases remained vague. Internal memos, where they existed, focused on logistics rather than rationale. This vacuum allowed interpretations to multiply. One version suggested that the place had outlived its usefulness as a symbol. Another insisted the opposite, that it mattered too much to be allowed to fail publicly. A third proposed that the real issue wasn't the estate at all. The family identity attached to it, stretched thin by decades of corporate and cultural change. None of these versions can be verified in full, but they persist because the silence invited them. It's worth noting that nothing physically catastrophic happened. No fire, no collapse, no scandal that could be reduced to a headline. That absence is part of the problem. The most destabilizing failures are often the ones without a clear moment of impact. They feel unreal until the consequences are unavoidable. By the time the gates closed, most of the damage had already been done quietly. The closure itself solved nothing. It only paused exposure. Those who believed it would create space for reinvention underestimated how difficult it is to reframe something built to embody certainty. You can renovate structures, you can update signage, but reassigning meaning is slower and far less controllable, especially when the original meaning was never fully acknowledged as fragile. What follows is not a story of sudden downfall, but of delayed recognition, of decisions that made sense locally and failed collectively, of a symbol that functioned perfectly until the context shifted and no one recalibrated in time. The estate didn't collapse under scrutiny. It stalled under the weight of its own inheritance. And the most unsettling part is this: many of the choices that led here were considered reasonable when they were made. That is what makes what comes next harder to untangle. Because the cost was not paid immediately, it was deferred. And deferred costs always return with interest. The estate had always functioned on an unspoken agreement. As long as it remained useful as a symbol, its costs, financial, cultural, operational, were tolerated, sometimes ignored, sometimes reframed as investment. The arrangement held because the return was not measured in revenue alone, but in reassurance, continuity, the suggestion that certain things, once built, could simply endure. That assumption began to fail quietly. Not because the place stopped working, but because it started demanding more attention than it gave back. Behind the scenes, maintenance became less predictable, not catastrophic, just relentless. Systems designed for an earlier era required constant adjustment. Repairs fixed symptoms, not causes. Every solution introduced a new dependence. One former contractor described the work as preservation without a finish line. No matter what was restored, something else surfaced. The estate consumed effort in a way that felt disproportionate to its visible output. It still looked stable. That was the problem. Publicly, the narrative held. Privately, tension accumulated. The place was expected to justify itself without evolving, to remain authentic without being static, to feel welcoming without inviting reinterpretation. These expectations were never formally articulated, but they shaped every operational choice. Some adaptations were attempted: new programming, subtle reframing of experience, language adjustments designed to soften edges without erasing identity. But these efforts created a different issue: inconsistency. Visitors sensed when parts of the story had been updated while others remained untouched. The result wasn't clarity, It was fragmentation, a sense that the place was hesitating, unsure which version of itself it was meant to be. A version that circulated among longtime planners suggested that the estate had become trapped between two audiences. One came for tradition, expecting reinforcement of a familiar narrative. The other arrived with modern skepticism, asking questions the space wasn't designed to answer. Satisfying either group was possible. Satisfying both simultaneously was not. So compromises multiplied. Compromises always cost more than decision. At some point, risk assessments replaced vision statement. That transition didn't happen overnight, but it changed everything. Choices were no longer evaluated on whether they strengthened the story, but on whether they minimized exposure. The measure of success shifted from engagement to containment. The estate began operating defensively. That posture seeps into every layer of an institution. Staff become cautious. Messaging grows vague. Innovation slows, not because ideas are absent, but because consequences are harder to predict than inaction. And inaction, for a while, feels safer. What makes this phase difficult to pinpoint is how reasonable each individual step appeared. Reducing certain programs saved resources. Limiting access reduced liability. Narrowing narratives prevented misinterpretation. None of these choices were inherently irrational. The problem was cumulative. Each decision shrank the estate's role slightly, not enough to alarm, but enough to erode momentum. Over time, the place shifted from being something people actively sought out to something they remembered fondly but postponed revisiting. Deferred relevance is hard to reverse. Internally, some voices pushed for a reset, not cosmetic changes, but structural rethinking, acknowledging complexity rather than smoothing it over, allowing the place to become something adjacent to what it had been, rather than insisting it remain unchanged. Those proposals rarely advanced far. According to one account, the resistance wasn't ideological. It was emotional. Letting the place change felt too close to admitting that its original form was no longer sufficient, and sufficiency had always been its promise. So the reset never came. Instead, pressure built where no one was looking. Logistics, staffing, long-term planning. The estate required constant justification at levels far removed from the visitor experience. When questions started coming from outside about relevance, cost, future, the answers were technically correct but conceptually thin. They explained operations, not purpose. Purpose is harder to defend when it hasn't been revisited in years. By the time closure was considered, it wasn't framed as failure. It was framed as pause, reassessment, strategic patience. Those terms suggest control. They imply that time itself can be used as a tool. But time only helps if something changes during the wait. What no official statement addressed was the deeper issue. The estate had become too precise in what it refused to be, and too vague in what it claimed to represent. That imbalance made every public-facing action feel provisional, temporary, reversible, and places built on legacy do not thrive on provisional identity. One former employee described the final months before closure as working inside a question mark. Procedures continued, but conviction didn't. Everyone sensed that the current configuration couldn't hold indefinitely, yet no alternative had been agreed upon. When the gates finally closed, there was relief alongside uncertainty. Relief that the strain of explanation had paused. Uncertainty about whether reopening would ever feel natural again. This is the moment when many assume the story shifts toward resolution. It doesn't. Because closure didn't resolve the underlying tension, it preserved it, like freezing a system mid-error and hoping the restart will correct what was never debugged. What follows is not a reinvention, but a confrontation with something that had been postponed too long. The estate was no longer just a place. It was a decision deferred across generations, and deferred decisions, once exposed, rarely remain abstract. They demand to be named. By the time anyone was willing to admit there was a problem, it had already stopped being measurable. There was no single ledger where the loss appeared, no quarterly report that captured what was slipping away. The damage wasn't financial first. It was interpretive. The estate still existed, still functioned, still complied, but fewer people could explain, with confidence, why it mattered now. That kind of loss rarely triggers alarm. Institutions are good at tracking money. They are less equipped to notice when meaning begins to thin. One version repeated among former planners suggested that the estate's greatest vulnerability was not controversy, but predictability. The experience had become so carefully controlled that it left no room for discovery. Visitors left having seen exactly what they expected, and nothing that lingered. Predictability feels safe until it turns into irrelevant. The irony was that the place had once thrived on a sense of access. Not just physical access, but emotional proximity. It invited visitors to feel close to something larger than themselves. Over time, that invitation narrowed. What remained was presentation, without tension. Internally, this shift produced subtle but corrosive effects. Staff stopped improvising. Guides stuck closely to approved phrasing. Deviations, once seen as personal flair, were quietly discouraged. The message became consistent, but thinner. Consistency without depth creates silence, not clarity. One longtime employee recalled noticing when new hires stopped asking questions about the place's history. They memorized scripts efficiently, but curiosity was no longer required. That efficiency was praised. No one paused to consider what had been traded away. As engagement declined, explanations multiplied. Some blamed changing audience. Others pointed to external pressure, media cycle, cultural shifts, heightened scrutiny. All of these explanations had merit. None addressed the structural issue forming underneath. The estate had been designed to symbolize certainty in a world increasingly suspicious of it. That mismatch created friction that no amount of refinement could eliminate. At some point, the place began operating as if scrutiny itself were the threat. That assumption shaped decisions in ways that were never acknowledged publicly. Openness was recalibrated, context was reduced, complexity was avoided rather than managed. The goal became to say nothing that could be misread, but silence is also a statement. Visitors noticed what wasn't said more than what was. The most damaging consequence of this posture was not criticism, but disengagement. Fewer people argued with the narrative because fewer people engaged deeply enough to challenge it. Interest faded into polite indifference. For a place built on legacy, indifference is more dangerous than opposition. Opposition keeps something alive. Indifference lets it disappear quietly. A former advisor described a meeting where the question was raised, tentatively, about whether the estate should stop trying to represent continuity at all. Perhaps it could become something more limited, more honest about its constraints, less burdened by inherited expectations. The idea never moved forward. According to that account, the concern was not feasibility, but optics. Admitting limitation felt too close to diminishing the original vision, and diminishing the vision felt unacceptable, so the vision remained intact, even as its relevance eroded. When closure finally arrived, it was framed as temporary, but its emotional impact was immediate. Employees were reassigned or released. Long-standing routines vanished overnight. For many, the loss was not just professional, but personal. The estate had structured their lives for years. Its sudden absence left a gap that no internal memo addressed. Outside, the response was muted. There were no mass protests, no public outcry. A few disappointed reactions, followed by resignation. The quietness of that response unsettled some insiders more than outrage would have. It suggested that the place had already slipped from necessity into nostalgia. In the months that followed, discussions about reopening became increasingly abstract. Plans existed on paper, but consensus did not. Every proposal seemed to require agreement on something deeper first, what the estate was now allowed to be. That question had no easy answer. To change too much risked alienating those who still cared. To change too little risked reopening to irrelevant. The middle ground, once a strength, had become unstable. This is the stage where deferred costs surface most clearly, not as bills, but as paralysis. The estate had reached a point where every option carried symbolic weight. Doing nothing preserved the problem. Doing something risked redefining the entire legacy. That kind of decision cannot be delegated, and it cannot be rushed. What few acknowledged openly was that the estate was no longer paying for past decisions. It was paying for the refusal to revisit them. Choices that once felt permanent had been treated as untouchable, even as circumstances changed. The cost of that rigidity accumulated slowly, invisibly, until flexibility itself became expensive. This is not the moment of collapse. It is the moment before naming, before acknowledging that the issue was never just operational, or cultural, or financial. It was structural, but not in the way most people assume. Something fundamental had been misunderstood from the beginning, and in the next phase, that misunderstanding can no longer remain implicit, because once symbols stop absorbing meaning, they begin to demand it. The first explicit disagreement did not happen in a boardroom. It happened in fragments, emails that stopped short of conclusions, meetings where the same question was postponed again, conversations that circled an issue without naming it. Everyone involved sensed that the estate had crossed from being a representation into being a liability, but no one agreed on why. That disagreement mattered more than any financial metric, because once a symbol loses consensus, it stops functioning as one. For years, the estate had been allowed to stand in for something larger than itself: heritage, stability, continuity across generations. These meanings were never voted on, never codified. They were inherited assumptions, passed down through repetition. The problem was not that these assumptions were false. The problem was that they had become compulsory. Any attempt to reinterpret the estate now felt like an act of defiance rather than adaptation. What had once been a flexible symbol had hardened into a fixed expectation, and fixed expectations break under changing conditions. Several internal accounts describe a growing discomfort with how often decisions were justified by precedent rather than context. Phrases like, "This is how it's always been done," began appearing not as shorthand, but as barriers. Precedent became protection. Protection against what, exactly, was never fully articulated. But the fear underneath was recognizable, that changing the estate would expose something fragile about what it represented. That fear slowed everything. One proposal that gained brief traction involved partial reopening, limited access, curated experience, controlled message. It was designed to test engagement without committing to full reinvention. The idea stalled. According to one version, the concern was that even limited reopening would invite questions no one was prepared to answer. Questions not about logistics, but about meaning. Why this place still existed, what it stood for now, who it was for. Those questions had no approved responses. The longer the estate remained closed, the more it drifted from lived experience into abstraction. It became something discussed rather than visited, remembered rather than encountered. This shift altered the balance of power. When a place is experienced directly, it can correct misconceptions through presence. When it exists only as an idea, it becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation by those who no longer feel invested in its preservation. Silence creates space, and space fills quickly. Outside narratives began to evolve independently. Articles framed the closure as emblematic rather than specific. Commentators spoke of it as a sign of broader cultural shifts. The estate was no longer just an estate. It became shorthand. Shorthand is rarely precise. This worried some insiders, not because the narratives were entirely wrong, but because they were no longer controllable. Once the estate stopped speaking for itself, others did it instead, and they did not agree. One internal document, referenced indirectly by multiple sources, warned that prolonged closure risked reframing the estate as avoidance rather than transition. That perception, once established, would be difficult to undo. Avoidance suggests guilt. Transition suggests intention. The difference between the two is not structural, it is communicative. No clear communication followed. What complicates this phase further is the absence of a clear villain. No reckless executive, no sudden scandal, no dramatic betrayal. The estate did not fail because of one bad actor. It drifted because of collective caution. Each individual decision was defensible. Together, they produced paralysis. Paralysis is not neutral. It favors decay. There were moments when reopening seemed imminent. Contractors consulted, proposals revised, timelines floated and quietly retracted. Each near movement raised expectations, then flattened them. This cycle eroded confidence internally. Staff members who remained began to doubt whether the estate would ever regain momentum. Not because it couldn't, but because no one seemed willing to own the transformation it required. Ownership, in this context, meant responsibility for redefining legacy. That responsibility proved heavier than expected. A version that circulated among senior advisors suggested that the estate had become a mirror no one wanted to look into too closely. It reflected not just the past, but the difficulty of carrying inherited meaning forward without distortion. Symbols demand maintenance, but they also demand reinterpretation. Refusing one eventually undermines the other. By this stage, the cost was no longer invisible. It showed up as hesitation, as delayed decision, as resources spent preserving optionality rather than direction. The estate consumed attention without producing clarity. That imbalance is unsustainable. This is the point where many observers assume a resolution must follow, a reopening, a rebrand, a decisive shift. But the situation resisted clean outcomes. Because the question was no longer what to do with the estate, it was whether the estate could survive being honest about what it was and what it was not. That honesty would require acknowledging that the original promise of permanence had limits. That continuity was never guaranteed, only maintained through constant recalibration. For a symbol built on endurance, admitting limits felt like failure. So the admission was deferred. What remains now is tension held in suspension, a place waiting for a decision that cannot be incremental, a legacy that cannot be preserved by standing still. A symbol that has begun charging interest on every year, it remains unresolved. The final chapter does not offer restoration or collapse. It offers naming, because only when the underlying error is finally articulated, even tentatively, can the estate move from stagnation into whatever comes next. And that naming changes everything. For a long time, the estate was treated as if it could only fail by action, by controversy, by scandal, by some visible rupture that would justify intervention. As long as none of that happened, stability was assumed. Silence was interpreted as safety. That assumption turned out to be the mistake. Not a dramatic one, not a reckless one, but a structural one that hid comfortably inside good intention. The error, if one accepts the version that gained traction only very late, was not that the estate changed too little or too much. It was that it was never allowed to admit that it had already changed. From the moment it became public-facing, it stopped being purely inherited and became negotiated. Every visitor, every guide, every retelling adjusted its meaning slightly. That process was gradual, uneven, and unavoidable. But the institutions surrounding it continued to behave as if meaning were fixed. That mismatch widened over time. One interpretation, repeated quietly among those no longer involved, suggested that the estate was burdened by a promise it never explicitly made, that it would stand outside history rather than inside it, that it would represent continuity without requiring reinterpretation. No place can do that indefinitely. Places survive by absorbing context, not resisting what finally surfaced. Too late to prevent closure, but early enough to complicate reopening, was the realization that preservation had been mistaken for protection. By trying to shield the estate from reinterpretation, decision-makers had also shielded it from relevance. Relevance, unlike tradition, must be renewed. This was never acknowledged publicly. But internally, the implications were unsettling. If the estate's problem was not external pressure, but internal rigidity, then no amount of waiting would fix it. Waiting had been the strategy. The hardest part of naming this error was that no one could be blamed cleanly. Each generation had acted reasonably within its context. Each adjustment made sense locally. The failure emerged only when those choices were viewed as a sequence rather than as isolated responses. That is how structural errors work. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate permission. Once this framing appeared, even tentatively, It changed how the entire situation looked. The closure was no longer just a pause. It became evident, proof that the estate could not continue under the same assumptions that had sustained it before. Reopening would not be a return. It would be a declaration. And declarations require clarity. Some argued that the estate should embrace limitation openly, acknowledge that it represented a specific moment, not an eternal one. Others believed that doing so would undermine the very reason it existed in public memory. That disagreement remains unresolved. What is clear is that the estate can no longer function as a neutral symbol. Neutrality was always an illusion maintained by repetition. Once repetition broke, neutrality collapsed with it. If one accepts the most persuasive version of events, then the tragedy is not that the estate closed. It is that it stayed open too long without renegotiating its role. By the time closure occurred, the work that should have been done incrementally now required a decisive shift. The cost of delay transformed adaptation into disruption. That transformation frightened those tasked with stewardship. This does not mean the estate failed. It means it outlived the framework that once made it legible. Places, like institutions, require periodic reconsent, not legal consent, but cultural. When that consent is assumed, rather than renewed, erosion begins quietly. By the time anyone notices, the structure still stands, but the agreement that held it up is gone. There are still versions of the future in circulation. Some envision reopening under a narrowed scope. Others imagine integration into something adjacent rather than standalone. A few believe it should remain closed indefinitely, preserved as absent rather than misinterpreted present. None of these outcomes resolve the underlying tension completely, because the tension was never about access. It was about ownership of meaning. If this version is true, and it remains only a version, then the estate was never doomed by controversy or decline. It was undone by an assumption inherited without question. That legacy is something you guard, rather than something you renegotiate. That assumption worked until it didn't. The gates may open again, or they may not. But even if they do, the place will not be the same. Not because time passed, but because the illusion of permanence has already been broken. What remains is a choice: to treat that break as loss, or to accept it as the moment when the estate finally became honest about what it had always been, a constructed symbol, dependent on context, vulnerable to silence, and incapable of surviving without interpretation. That realization does not end the story. It explains why it could no longer continue as it was, and why whatever comes next, if anything, will carry a different weight, not inherited, chosen.